Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Ich stehe deiner Krippen hier, which translates to I stand before thy manger fair. Fairly straightforward chorale, not too much to talk about here. Some consistent subdivisions which create like symmetry in the form a little bit. I'll point out when those occur, but for all intents and purposes, this is one of the more straightforward chorales we've had in the Christmas oratorio saga that we've been looking at, because the last several videos have belonged to the Christmas oratorio. But starting things off, we have one sharp in the key signature. We start with the G major chord, we end with a G major chord. I think it's safe to say we're in the key of G major. Passing seventh in the bass, and then we get E, B, E, and G. That's E minor, which is 6. Passing tones in the upper voices, and then we get another E minor chord here. No need to reanalyze. Delayed passing seventh here in the bass, and then we get C, E, G, and A. That's A minor 7 over C. Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, and this is going to be part of some type of like quasi-cadential progression, because we have an anticipation in the tenor here as well as a neighbor tone in the alto, and that creates A, D, F sharp, C, D, F sharp, and A, which is D7 over C. That's a 5-4-2 chord, and then we get a resolution on the next beat to G major in first inversion, C, D, G, and G, of course with the C being a lower suspension. It's this B here that's our chord tone. That's G major over B. Then we get C, E, G, and A again. That's another 2, 6, 5 chord, A minor 7 over C. And then we have D major, D, A, F sharp, and A. That's our 5 chord. This D is a chord tone. Sorry to neglect this C and A here. Those are also both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And then our first cadence is an imperfect authentic cadence where we cadence on G major, tonic triad, root position. Straightforward first phrase. Then we're going to move to the key, we're staying in the key of G major for the next phrase. We're going to move to a phrase that concludes with a perfect authentic cadence. We start things off with C major, C, E, E, and G. It's a 4 chord. And we have a little bit of subdivision going on here as well. F sharp, A, C, and E. It's like F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over C, which is a 7-4-3 chord. And that goes to G major, G, D, G, and B. Very normative progression. Probably the most common subdivided progression we see in Bach is 4 going to 7. And then we have passing 7th in the bass here. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get C, G, B, and C, E, G, B, and C. I look at this chord as it's either some type of A minor thing going on here or C major 7. I hear it as C major 7 over E, C major 7 over E, which would be 4, 6, 5. But with the A's going on as well, I think you could argue that this is also a 2, 6, 4 chord. It's less likely because it doesn't function the way that a 6-4 chord typically would, or the context really isn't here to justify a 6-4 chord. Sometimes we see 6-4 chords that don't belong to like a passing or a pedal figure, but in this context, I think we're okay if you went with calling this a 2-6-4 chord, because we get pretty contrapuntal. None of the voices are really doing the same thing here. But yeah, I'm going to treat these A's as non-chord tones. This G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have B, B, F sharp, and D. It's a 3 chord in root position, B minor. Then we have A and C going on here, and this I think is another chord progression. At first I hadn't really marked this because it did feel like a 5 chord. It didn't really feel like a 5 chord the first time I listened to it, but the notes are there, and we see this 5 chord later in the chorale as well, which makes me feel like this is significant because this 3 is ultimately functioning like a predominant chord. It's one of the least common predominant chords in Bach, but we do see it from time to time. And then 5 resolves to 1, G, D, G, and C. This time the C is in the melody, not in the bass, just like we saw earlier, so it's interesting how that happens. But this B is our chord tone. This is a tonic triad in root position. Following our tonic triad, we have D major, D, D, G, and A, but this G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and this G is also ornamental as well, where the alto and the soprano are singing the same note. Very cool when Bach does that. It's still implying our 5 chord. On the next beat, we get the resolution, but we also introduce the 7th of the chord here, D, C, F sharp, and A. It's a 5/7. So we'll just change the figure bass, and this anticipation here in the alto leads us to G major, G, B, D, and G, tonic triad, root position. Okay, looking ahead, we are still in the key of G major. This just happens to be a half cadence. This D sharp's kind of like a false red flag. It's just tonicizing E minor, but we have not moved to the key of E minor. So we start off with G major, G, D, G, and B. No need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the bass, and then we have B, D, G, and B. Just taking the chord and putting it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Another passing tone in the bass, and then we get D, D, G, and A. And similar to the cadence that we just had before, I think that instead of being just a 5 chord, I think this is 5/7, because by the time we get the resolution, Bach introduces the 7th of the chord as well. So I'm going to call it a 5/7, but 5 is just fine as well. We then have G, B, F sharp, and D, which is interesting. I think this F sharp is part of a 7/6 suspension over the bass, but we know that a tonic triad is being implied here. We had a similar chord in yesterday's chorale like this as well. But he does get contrapuntal in this section and sort of elides into another chord, A, C, E, and G, which is just a 2/7 chord happening off of the harmonic rhythm, A minor 7. And then we get B, F sharp, E, and F sharp again with another accented non-chord tone here. That's B major, because we're looking at this D sharp, and this B is a chord tone. Everything else is a chord tone except for the E. This is a secondary dominant, which would be 5 of 6, because B is the dominant of E, and E is our 6 chord, and that's exactly where it goes, E, B, E, and G. It's E minor. Sorry, I was calling it E. So B is the dominant of E, but our 6th chord in the key of G major is E minor. Anticipation in the tenor and passing tones in the outer voices, which give us F sharp, A, E, and A. And I'm going to mark this, even though it's an incomplete chord, as a passing 7 chord, F sharp minor 7 flat 5. We don't have a 5 here. That kind of weakens it a little bit. So I'm actually going to just call those passing tones and not include the chord then, because I thought one of these were a C. I just misread my clefs again. I always get confused between the clefs. I'm probably dyslexic when it comes to reading staff music. It's always been very difficult for me. But when we have the 6th of the scale connected to the 1 of the scale in this ascending configuration, we always have a leading tone connecting the 6 and the 1. Typically we see 4/6 going to 1 here, but sometimes we see 6 as a substitute for 4/6. It'd be very interesting if we had a 4 chord here, because that would be a secondary deceptive progression, but here we have proper resolution. After our 6 chord we have G, A, D, and B. This A is like a 9/8 suspension over the bass, or I guess a 2/1 suspension, because, no, a 9/8. Sorry, I was reading. Wait, is that right? Yeah, no, a 2/1 suspension, because we're an octave below here. So the bass and the tenor are actually singing the same note here. Still, our 1 is being implied. And then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, D, and A. That's our 5 chord. Looking ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of E minor, so we do get a modulation in this chorale, as we typically do. We've only seen, I think, 2 chorales up until this point that haven't modulated in their entirety, so it would be very unusual if we didn't modulate, but we do go to E minor very briefly right at the end of the phrase. So we stay in the key of G major to start things off. D, F sharp, D, and A is another 5 chord, no need to reanalyze, passing 7th in the bass. Then we have B, G, D, and G. It's our tonic triad, G major in first inversion. Passing tone in the tenor, neighbor tone in the alto, and then we get B, B, D, and F sharp. That's another 3 chord if we literally look at it. And the reason why I feel like this is a 3 chord and I don't look to this B as like an accented non-chord tone and then look to the and of the B is because we have another 3 to 5/4/3 progression here, A, C, D, and F sharp. It seems to be a chord progression, or a subdivided chord progression more specifically, that Bach is leaning on for this particular chorale, because we've seen it once before and we're going to see it again. We then have G, B, D, and G, tonic triad. It's the exact same progression that we had earlier too. In fact, it's the same spelling. Oh, just kidding, it's not the exact same spelling. The melody and the alto are flipped, but the bass and the tenor are doing the same thing, so maybe there's something there. So after our tonic triad, we have some passing tones in the inner voices before we get G, G, B, and D. It's another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze, with a passing 7th in the bass. We then have E, G, B, and G. That's a 6 chord, E minor, passing 7th in the bass, kind of evoking the same progression we had at the beginning of the chorale. And then we get C, F sharp, E. Oh, apologies. We have to modulate to E minor at some point. Really, this is kind of a zone. Anywhere in this region of 3 beats, I think, is an appropriate place to mark the analysis, or to mark the modulation, rather. I think E minor is going to be the place that I mark it. We then have C, F sharp, E, and A. So this is a Phrygian half cadence. Let me further specify. I didn't want to give it away too early because I wanted that to be the point that I talk about when we got here. But if we look at the downbeat literally, we have C, F sharp, E, and A, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over C. That's 2, 4, 3. What we often find with Bach is that we have the F sharp versus the E, and this isn't just unique to E minor or just any key in particular. Often what we get in Phrygian half cadences is because of the counterpoint or because of the difference between these two pitches. It's the difference between 4/6 and 2/3. Sometimes there's an argument to be made for 2/3, but there's pretty much always in a Phrygian half cadence in Bach some way to interpret the chord as 4/6, which makes me feel like this is just an embellishment on the chord. So I analyze them as 4/6 chords. And then we cadence on 5. B, F sharp, D sharp, and B, which is our dominant in the key of E minor. And then we're going to look ahead to the end of the chorale. Ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G. We're looking for a point in which we modulate, and I think we stay in the key of E minor at least for the first couple of beats. We start off with E minor, E, E, B, and B. Did I read that right? E, E, B, and G. Sorry, I was messing up my clefs again. It's our tonic triad with some passing tones in the tenor and the melody. And then we get E, G, E, and B, which is another E minor chord in root position, so we don't need to reanalyze it. Then we have a passing 7th in the bass as well before we get C, G, E, and C. And I'm going to mark this as a 6 chord. That's how I hear it, but you could also call this a 4/6 chord, depending on whether you hear this A as a chord tone or this G as a chord tone. This just sounds like C major to me, like 1 going to 6. That's just how the progression impacted me. So I mark this A as a delayed passing tone, and this is where we go back to the key of G. This is now our 4 chord. We then go to B, B, D, and D. Another one of these interesting chords, but if we remember how our ending of our A section happened, or the chord progression, we're going to see Bach evoke pretty much the exact same thing. We start with this 4 chord, and then we see a near identical progression. We go to 3 here, B minor, B, B, D, and D. 3 chord, passing 7th in the bass. This C is a non-chord tone, this E is a non-chord tone, this F sharp is a chord tone. So that's the way that I have it analyzed. And again, remember this 4 chord was also made ambiguous as well, which further affirms the relationship between these two phrases. And then we get what happens? Oh no, apologies. What ends up happening here is we get 3 happening after the 4 chord, and then we have A, C, F sharp, and D. So this F sharp is a chord tone in context to the chord that's actually happening on the beat, our 3 chord, but it's also part of the 5-4-3 chord. That's what I was missing. I'm like 3 going to 1. That's an unusual progression. No, it's because we have 3 going to 5-3, and then we have a progression from 5-3 going to 1. G, D, G, and C. Exact same suspension figure that he had in the second phrase as well, where C goes down to B. And then we get ready for our cadence, which is for all intents and purposes the same thing as well. D, D, G, and A. Still implying a 5 chord, but this G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. This G is also part of this suspension. It dips into the same tone that the alto is singing. And then we get D, C, F sharp, and A, which is just taking our 5 chord and adding a 7th. We get an anticipation in the tenor, and then we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G. Me always confusing my clefs. That is today's analysis, though. Relatively straightforward, not too many twists and turns here. Actually, it's a very plain chorale from a harmonic standpoint, but I think it's really cool that we see this 3 to 5-4-3 progression in so many places. It makes me feel like Bach really did write all of these subdivided chord progressions with intention. One of the cool things that comes up from time to time when you analyze. But if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload. And you could also like the video if you enjoyed the video. It means also that my videos are going to get seen by more people. That's just how the YouTube algorithm works, or so I'm told. So more people get to watch the videos. That means there's potential for more discussion in the comments section, and we grow the community, which is exactly what I want to do. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.